Hello, it's Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Thursday, the 8th of September, 2022. Please click on the subscribe button here in the lower right to subscribe to the channel, and also click on the notification bell in the far upper right to be notified when future episodes are released. Now, today's topic is going to be the two great consequences or legacies, let's say, of the Civil War. There were two of them. First was the end of slavery. That happened in December 1865, when the 13th Amendment passed. And in an earlier post, I explained the reason the 13th Amendment passed is because the southern states voted to ratify the 13th Amendment. All but Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment in the 19th century, and almost all of the southern states did so before the ratification was completed in December of 1865. In fact, it was Georgia that made the threshold vote to have 3/4 of the states ratify the 13th Amendment. Now, the important point, as I've explained before, is that those Southern legislatures that did ratify the 13th Amendment were composed entirely of white Southern males, many of whom had served in the Confederate Army. They were ready to end slavery. Lee surrendered in April of 1865, and by December 1865, the amendment passed and slavery was ended. Again, I want to emphasize it was white Southern males of the former Confederate states that contributed to that by voting to end slavery with the 13th Amendment. The second great consequence of the Civil War was the increasing centralization of power in the federal government. Now, the typical viewpoint of the war was that it was Southerners that were fighting to preserve slavery. And when slavery ended, I mean, that was a great triumph because the Southerners were evil for wanting to perpetuate it. But the other great aim of the Confederacy was to stop the growth of the central powers. That was let's say, a noble objective for the Southern states, and there's no given any credit for that. But now we're at a point where it's obvious that the federal government has vastly increased its powers in the central government. I think this latest example, which is quite remarkable, really, is President Joe Biden's decision to grant up to $20,000 of forgiveness for student loan debts, $10,000 for those who attended college and are earning less than $250,000 a year if it's a married couple. And it's $20,000 for those that attended and received Pell Grants. Well, about 60% of Pell Grants, and keep in mind, Pell Grants are free money, gifts given to students to attend college. So about 60% of the students that received those Pell Grant gifts were Black. And they will get $20,000 in student loan debts forgiven, which of course means that somebody else has to pay them, and the somebody else is the taxpayer, who had nothing to do with making that obligation. But this was done by an executive order, which is even more extreme than implementing such a program after Congress has voted it into law. This was done by Biden really as a dictator. No, he had no authority to do it. Even Nancy Pelosi is caught on television saying a year ago that Biden had no authority to do this on his own. Now all of a sudden she's silent. But the overarching point here is that this is how far we've come with the centralization of power in the federal government. But it's been going on since the end of the Civil War. It started, like I say, at the end of the Civil War with Reconstruction. The first steps were to take away the power of the southern states to create their own governments. The federal government intervened through the Republican-controlled Congress that vetoed or they overrode any vetoes that President Andrew Johnson had against them. The central government, the Congress, put in place laws that changed the states' rights of the states to set their own voter registration requirements and their own voter requirements. They required in the southern states that all Black males be registered to vote. And that was just the beginning. The problem was not so much that Black males were permitted to vote, but the problem was that the Black males, over 95% of them, were for former slaves and had no experience in any kind of government. Many, I mean, again, over 90% were simply illiterate. And they were clearly tools to be manipulated by interlopers that would establish puppet regimes in the South that would endorse and support the policies of the Republican-controlled Congress in Washington, and then, of course, the Republican-controlled government in Washington once a Republican was elected president, as was Ulysses Grant in 1868, right after Andrew Johnson served his first term. Then you had a central government that increased the central powers to such an extent and eliminated states' rights to such an extent that even the northern states began to object. This began with the fraudulent elections in Louisiana in 1874. As I've explained before, Louisiana set up a voter counting board or canvassing board. It was elections in Louisiana had to be certified by the voter canvassing board. And the states that set those up were they were carpetbag controlled states. And therefore, it really did not matter what the true election outcome was, because the voter returning board of the carpetbag or scallywag government would then determine which votes were valid and get the vote results that the incumbent administration wanted. In 1874, the results were so obviously corrupted that even the Congress of the United States declared that there should be new elections, that they felt that there was so much corruption on both sides that new elections should be held. But President Grant, a Republican, overruled that. He put the incumbent carpetbag administration in control of Louisiana after the 1874 votes, even though, as I say, the federal Congress itself, which was Republican controlled, claimed that the results that gave that candidate the victory were corrupted. But Grant put him in office, and you began to see, particularly from the Midwest, you saw some of the politicians from that region begin to complain of the increasing power of the central federal government. I think it was James Garfield. If it wasn't him, it was somebody else who was pretty prominent, really quite prominent. Said that if they, meaning the central government, can overrule an election in the state of Louisiana, they could do so in Ohio, which is where James Garfield was from. So you began to see a turning away from that centralization of power because even some of the northern states began to fear the consequences of it. And when they started to turn away from that increasing centralization of power, Reconstruction started to come to an end, at least officially. Now, if you go through the years up to the present, you'll see that that trend towards an increasing centralization of power in the federal government has continued to grow. For example, when President Franklin Roosevelt became inaugurated, almost immediately after being inaugurated for the first time, he outlawed the gold standard. He directed that everyone who had any gold would turn it into the Treasury for paper money. If they had gold certificates, the same thing. Now, in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, yes, he was dealing with an economic emergency, but it was a true emergency. And it's been reasoned by many historians that something had to be done. But on top of that, when he did that, he didn't just do it on his own authority. He at least got the Congress to pass a law giving him the power to do that. Similarly, he closed the banks he called it a bank holiday. But he closed the banks for a period of time so that they could recover and begin to function and effectively and give the depositors a sense of security in the banking system. But that has continued, as I say, to the present day, in which we've come to a point where hundreds of billions of dollars, perhaps $1 trillion or more, of student loan debt is being forgiven simply by the action of the president with no congressional law approving it. He really did the same thing when he tried to force everyone to take vaccines. He claimed it to be an emergency, and he set the people that had the vaccines up as righteous, and the people that didn't take the vaccines as unrighteous. The people that are not taking the vaccines were really evil because what they were doing were putting everybody else at risk. And we've got to understand that he told us that the vaccines were safe. He told us that the vaccines were effective, and it's clear that they weren't effective. Clear that they weren't effective. But he tried to do this by executive order. Well, finally, we're at a point now where the states are beginning to fight back. So this latest example is there are lawsuits requiring that the White House reveal their communications with companies like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter to disclose how they colluded with those companies to suppress free speech, and particularly to suppress speech that opposed the ideas of the administration, free speech in opposition to the idea of the administration. The only thing that is bringing that to the light of day is the states' rights of Louisiana and Missouri, where the attorney generals have filed suit against the federal government to learn. We want to see the communications between the White House, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, where the White House tells them what they think is, what do they call it? Hate speech or unreliable information or misinformation. The White House is colluding with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to impose limits on what participants can say and to really impose a viewpoint that and to limit those those platforms to viewpoints that agree with the administration. If it wasn't for states' rights, nobody would be challenging that. Nobody has. But right now we're seeing Louisiana and Missouri, the attorneys general have filed in court to, we want to see the emails that were sent from the White House to those companies and what they said about disinformation and limiting and eliminating what the White House considered to be disinformation. Now, the reason there's the suit is there's two. One is because the states are fighting back. If it wasn't for the states, this wouldn't have happened. If it wasn't for states' rights, this wouldn't have happened. And the second thing is that the White House is so arrogant that their spokesperson, what's her name, Karine Jean-Pierre, has said that they've actually had communications with those organizations and the White House to eliminate disinformation on the platform. She said that publicly, and her predecessor, I can't remember her name, their predecessor said the same thing. So now it is states' rights that is giving us access to this information. If the courts, uphold it. Well, if you want to protect states' rights, that's a good enough reason for honoring the Confederacy. They fought to protect states' rights. There's no question about it. We've been over this before. States' rights and states' responsibilities are really opposite sides of the two coins. The typical academic will cynically say that the South only wanted to protect slavery. That was the only states' rights they wanted to protect. But no, they wanted to limit the power of the central government. It's clear from their Constitution. They outlawed, for example, in their Constitution, subsidies for private industry. They also outlawed public work spending by the central government. If there was going to be public work spending, it had to be by the states themselves. And in the case of Georgia, for example, the great locomotive chase during the Civil War took place on the Western Atlantic Railroad. That railroad was built by the state of Georgia, not by the federal government and not by the Confederate government. It was a public works project that had to be done by the states if it was to be done at all. But increasingly in the antebellum era, the Northerners wanted more and more of the central government money spent on these sorts of projects so that the states up north didn't have to spend them themselves. Okay, so that's my message for today. I do want to share with you something that I think will help you understand this. And that is this here, which is my book, Causes of the Civil War. It's $22 at Amazon. You can also get an Audible version. So if you like to have it read to you while you're driving your car or read to you while you're on your exercise machine or just out walking, the Audible version is available at Amazon. And then third, if you want to get an autographed copy from me, you can get an autographed copy from me for $26. I will pay the postage. And but you do have to email me, Phil, PHIL_Leigh, LEIGH @ me.com. Okay, thanks for watching.